The Unit 4C lesson is going to evaluate the historical developments of the 1960s and 70s, sort of a highlight reel of some of the bigger things that happened in those decades and how those events shaped the reality of America that we know today. Dwight Eisenhower, who was the military hero of World War II, is ushered in. He's offering radical change. He wanted a fair deal for everyone, but he also believed that Truman's Fair Deal and the New Deals under Roosevelt had been an expansion of federal government and federal power. He promised he, along with Richard Nixon, could offer dramatic change. So they win, and then they win again in 1956. During this post-war era, you have a dramatic shift in the role of women. If you look at the pictures here, the women's photos and posters on the right were during World War II. And then in the 50s and 60s on the left, you have much more traditional roles of women emerging again and glorified. This is a push of women back into the cult of domesticity for many reasons. One reason is people wanted to go back to life as normal in the post-war era. But also, women needed to evacuate those jobs so that men could hold them again. In 1960, Richard Nixon, who has been vice president, runs against John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy has very little experience. He's a relative newcomer. But he, as was quoted many times, combined the best qualities of Elvis Presley and Franklin Roosevelt. He was loved, he was handsome, he was charming, he had a beautiful wife and a young family. And the other thing that set this election apart would be the first televised debate. Up until this time in history, presidential elections and debates had occurred on the radio. This was the first time there would be TV cameras that the candidates could appeal to directly. A couple of things stood out about this debate. Obviously, Kennedy was newer to politics, had a little bit more relaxed style. Nixon seemed tense. He was described as having shifty eyes. But JFK had spent the weekend with Jackie at the Cape. He was rested. He was tanned. Nixon was in some pain from a previous injury, seemed to be coming down with a cold. When the television producers asked Kennedy and Nixon, do they want makeup, Kennedy refused. So, of course, Nixon, out of vanity, refuses as well. But Kennedy had a makeup and fashion clothing consultant. And so then Nixon sent one of his assistants out to buy just the cheapest dime store makeup there was. He was sweating. He was obviously in pain. And overwhelmingly, the people that watched the debate on TV said Kennedy won. But the people who listened on the radio said that Nixon won. And it is likely that this discrepancy was due to the differences in the way they look. This is the beginning of the era when television is going to dominate politics, and in fact you'll need to be as much a TV star as a politician in order to be elected. The rumors about Kennedy were that he was glamorous and had this exciting lifestyle. The reality is he was actually very sick. He had various diseases. His father, Joe, hid in safe deposit boxes throughout the United States medicines. He had stashes of meds so that if Kennedy were to be sick on the campaign trail, he could get to him the necessary medication without having to let an outside doctor into their inner circle. But in the election of 1960, he wins. He becomes a relentless campaigner, and in doing so, it really transforms American politics because this ushers in the era of political television and political theater. Just 3 short years later, John F. Kennedy will be assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. As he rode through the streets of Dallas, he rode in a convertible. despite some dealings he'd had, obviously dealing with civil rights crises. His brother Bobby, who was Attorney General, had gone after the mob. Obviously, the Cold War was going on, so there were lots of people that could have been blamed, or were suspects, rather, for his death. But he was in this convertible and then killed. There was a lot of paranoia around it. How many shooters were there? But Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the vice president, insisted on taking the oath of office before they left Dallas. Now, one of the things that's significant about this is Bobby Kennedy spoke with Johnson and said, please let him come back to Washington as the president. But Lyndon B. Johnson claimed he was afraid it would make America look weak. The reality is Johnson was very much an opportunist. In fact, when Jackie got back to the plane from the hospital, Lyndon B. Johnson was already sprawled across the bed in their presidential quarters. So he definitely had a political game to play when he forced his way and insisted on taking the oath of office in Dallas. Jackie had actually already changed out of the bloody clothes that you see here that were in these photos. She'd already changed out of those clothes, and she put them back on because she said, if I have to stand by him while he does this, even though we've asked him to wait, then I want the whole country to see this, blood-stained message that she had. In addition to the turmoil of the civil rights movement and the Kennedy assassination, during the 60s, you also have various protest movements that emerge in the U.S. The New Left, anti-war, was very focused on Vietnam counterculture, which in general ran counter to any traditional values. It was anti-monogamy, marriage, family, make love, not war, anything that was outside of the norm or counter to accepted culture. And then you are going to have something emerge known as the New Feminism. This is going to be a women's rights movement that is focused on equal rights, especially fighting against the cult of domesticity and insisting on reproductive rights that will eventually culminate into the Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade. Nixon comes to power and hoping in 1968 to go to empower the great silent majority. He believed that though there were loud voices in these protest movements, that the majority of Americans were quietly at home, irritated with the transformation of life and all of the new liberalism that was emerging, and he put his bet on the great silent majority. When you think of Richard Nixon, you most likely think of Watergate. However, before Watergate, he was actually very popular.
On June 17, 1972, a security guard called the Washington, D.C. police to the Watergate office complex after finding tape covering locks on several doors. The police found 5 men in the office of the Democratic National Committee. They were arrested and charged with attempted burglary.
On June 17, 1972, a security guard called the Washington, D.C. police to the Watergate office complex after finding tape covering locks on several doors. The police found 5 men in the office of the Democratic National Committee. They were arrested and charged with attempted burglary and attempting to bug phone lines. Each burglar had thousands of dollars in his pocket, and all of them had ties to the Committee to Re-elect the President.
Over the next 2+ years, one of the great acts of investigative journalism unfolds. Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward follow the money behind the Watergate break-in and trace it back to the Committee to Re-elect the President. It turns out the committee had a slush fund that funded all sorts of other illegal activities which could be traced back to the President of the United States, Richard Nixon.
9 months after the break-in, one of the burglars claimed there was a high-level cover-up of the crime.
Over the next several months, it gets even more interesting. Using clandestine information from an FBI source known only as Deep Throat, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward start to find out about other illegal acts. And it's their reporting that gets Congress to start asking questions of the White House.
Woodward and Bernstein's investigation led them to the highest levels of government. White House counsel John Dean was the first to testify that the president was involved in the cover-up of the crime. In July 1973, it was revealed that Nixon secretly taped almost all White House conversations. The prosecutor demanded Nixon turn in his recordings. He refused, but by June of 1974, after 22 persons linked to the burglary were indicted on conspiracy charges, the Supreme Court ordered the secret presidential tapes to be turned over.
When the tapes are finally submitted, investigators hear Nixon talking about the burglary and the cover-up, facing the prospect of almost certain impeachment.
So after Watergate, Nixon is certain to be impeached. There's an investigation. He resigns. Before he resigns, his vice president, who is implicated, Spiro Agnew, resigns. And this paves the way for the only unelected president in American history. So in the throes of the Watergate scandal, after Spiro Agnew resigned, Nixon and Gerald Ford meet, and the implication in hindsight is that Nixon said, I'll make you vice president, and then when I resign, you have to pardon me. And if you'll do that, then you get to be president. So Gerald Ford becomes his VP. He was the House Minority Leader at the time. When Nixon resigns, Ford pardons him for breaking the law, and Ford becomes America's unelected president. In 1976, Jimmy Carter runs against Ford, who still has the stain of this Watergate and this deal on his conscience. So he runs against Carter and Ronald Reagan, who will lead the Reagan Revolution in 1980. Ronald Reagan runs. This splits the Republican vote and paves the way for Jimmy Carter to narrowly eke out a victory. The historical developments of these eras really shape how we view things in America today. In light of the presidency, journalists are considered constantly investigating and pushing and challenging, especially conservative leaders. You have a complete transformation of the way the presidency is run because of television and the impact of that. So these modern events really transformed everything, even up until the presidency of Donald Trump, which we know largely came from his popularity as a TV star.